Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? Here on Cowboy Tyne's Story, we ride the stories of the West campfire. Truths, trail dust, memories, saloon whispers. Gritty humans, sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. Coldwater Bend woke in a pale blue light. Frost filmed the windows above the freight office. A wind came off the high rims and set the telegraph wires to a thin, nervous singing. Cole Mercer paused in the street and lifted his chin as if to let the air speak. He could taste metal, not blood, iron. It found the scar at his neck and tugged there tight as a cinched knot. The stock horses at the Silver Butte Corral shifted and stamped ears, slewing north. Cole checked their rails by habit. He wore plain denim and a hat pulled low, a tall man who knew how to be smaller than the morning. At the livery, coal smoke held to the rafters. Harness hung in dark, oily loops. Luther Rourke, bull-shouldered and loud, was banging a wrench against a bent axle. The stage bay in the back wore a new coat of yellow paint that could not hide old scars. 10 children swarmed the door like quail. A woman stepped in and the noise tucked itself flatter. Ada Whitfield said her name to Rourke and laid a folded list on his counter. Her dress was hard wool, traveled dark. She had the kept look of someone who had been responsible too long. She counted the children with her eyes while she spoke of tickets and wagons and mules. A boy with quick feet kicked a drift of dirty sawdust onto a gentleman's trouser cuff. Ada did not look, only said Thomas in a tone that made the boy stop kicking the world. Cole was in the back stall with a raw-boned mare that did not like the echo of tools. He kept one hand to her shoulder and breathed low, steady. The mare found him and steadied too. Ada crossed toward Rourke's office, and her heels snagged on a loose plank. The floor lifted under the misstep. She was falling into the mare's space. Cole moved without thinking. He put his palm to the stall post between her and the horse. He did not touch her. His arm took the shock, and his body blocked the animal's shoulder. For a moment, the two of them shared the smell of pine soap and horse and the bright cold of the morning. "Thank you," she said. Cole tipped his hat. He stepped back into shadow where the mare could see his shape again. Ada faced Rourke and spoke of a connecting caravan through the mountains. Rourke said the line was set. He said it loudly, like a promise that needed volume. Cole straightened and looked past them to the north wall of the livery. The boards there were bare and cold. The wind pressed from that side and found every seam. "Bank the north wall with hay," he said to Rourke, "top to eaves." Rourke looked up over his wrench. That would be a fool's night's work. For what? "Extra blankets for the yellow coach," Cole said. "Oilcloth, too." Rourke breathed a laugh. "Almanac says fair." He jerked his chin toward a clipping thumbtacked by the door. "Clear and seasonal through the week." Cole's gray eyes did not leave the north wall. "Almanac does not have a tongue." Rourke swore under his breath and went back to the axle. He was used to Cole's silence. He was not used to being advised. The children found their way to the stall door. They watched the mare's eye, then Cole's hands, and then his face. The boy called Thomas pointed straight at the scar at Cole's neck. "Hush," Thomas Otta said, not looking. "Manners." "It is rope," the boy whispered anyway, because truth begged to be said when you were his age. Cole let the talk pass him. He stroked the mare where the hide warmed under hair. Ada drew closer to the stage bay. She ran a palm over the painted panel as if the color might rub off on her gloves. She talked in a firm voice about schedules and safety. There was a tiredness under the firmness that did not apologize for itself. Cole set a stack of worn silver coins on Rourke's counter, enough for hay and blankets and oilcloth. No one asked him for the money. He pushed it forward. Rourke squinted. "You paying for weather now, Mercer?" Cole's mouth made a small line that was not a smile. He turned his head toward the open door. The wind carried a smell of iron filings, hot and faint, as if a file had just pulled a burr off a nail. Ada caught him looking that way. She did not ask why. She had the habit of not adding questions to rooms that already held too many. Outside, the street worked at its morning. Wagon rims gritted over ice. The far church bell rang once thin and alone, as if a hand had tested the rope and let it go. Across the alley, Owen Maddox's smithy spat sparks into the cold. A boy ran with a bundle of posts twice his height, the posts tapping the ground in a humble drum. Ada finished with Rourke and led her students toward the back to see the mules in their stalls. Children always want to see something with eyes. They made a chain of mittens and boots, 2 by 2. Names rose and fell in her mouth. Abraham, Sarah, Eliza. She did not forget any. The mules were warm stink and low patience. Ada spoke to them as if they were students. "Quiet, old one. We do not bite." Cole checked the stage's boot and the lashings at the corners. His fingers learned the ropes the way a physician learns a pulse. He did not hurry. He tightened where a knot looked lazy and set a proper hitch where a loop would creep. His bad hand ignored its ache because there was a task. "You ever going to talk like a man?" Mercer Rourke called from his bench, cheerful and barbed. "Or are you going to think us all to death?" Cole looked back at him. The telegraph wire sang a note that made the roof tin tremble. He lifted his chin again and tasted the iron. Then the taste was gone for a moment, and the air was only cold. Ada gathered her papers and her breath. The children were already writing the day in their heads, each in their own chapter. The boy, Thomas, had found a splinter and treated it like treasure. The mare in the back stall dropped her head and blew steam onto Cole's sleeve. He pressed his wrist to her cheek and felt the skin twitch there, a small animal trust. He nodded to no one and to her. When he left the livery, the street had gone quieter. Snow in the alley lay thin and brittle like it would shatter instead of sink. Cole stepped into it and made no sound he could hear above the wire's song. He looked north. The rims wore a light that was not bright. He could feel the pull at the scar, a tidy tug like the first tug on a bell rope. He put his hat down and walked along the boardwalk toward the corral. He did not carry a plan in his hands. He carried rope and a way of seeing. The bell rang once again, and the note hung in the winter air, and changed nothing, and changed the morning a little. By 8, the street had a hard shine to it. Wagon rims rang on ice, and mule bells ticked like tin coins. Rourke's boys heaved trunks into the yellow coach. The new oilcloth crackled under their hands. 2 extra wool blankets rode over the seatbacks, gray as river rock. Ada Whitfield counted to 10 without speaking. She touched each child on the shoulder and watched mouths form a promise back to her. 2 by 2, mittens linked, they climbed into the coach and made a narrow bench of knees. Someone breathed a laugh. Someone's hat went crooked, and 3 hands tried to fix it at once. Boone Kearney sat a broad bay and wore authority like a coat. He turned his head to catch the town watching him, and gave them a grin that showed a gold tooth. "We go easy," he said, voice big eyes quick. "Road is packed. Almanac says fair. Devil's Backbone is nothing to a good wheel." Riley Voss pushed past the last mule and slapped a crate with a flat palm. He looked at the children and then at Ada and made his mouth sour. "Teacher," he said, like it was a wrong note. Ada held his look for a beat, then set it aside the way she set aside a stain you could not scrub out right now. She slipped one palm along the yellow panel of the coach, felt where a nailhead sat proud, and moved it with her thumb. She looked at the blankets and said a quiet thank you to no one present. Out in the north, the rims wore a ribbon of cloud that did not move. The telegraph wire sang again a thin, high string. Cole Mercer stood at the corner by the corral and watched the line go. He touched the scar at his neck with 2 fingers and then put his hand down. The mare in the back lot blew into the cold, and the sound came like a small ghost between boards. The coach rocked and took the street. The caravan made a clumsy, jangling parade past the church. The bell pulled a single note and let it fall. Kids in doorways waved with hands still red from pump water. The smith raised his hammer and then lowered it without the blow, as if sound would be too much right there. Cole watched until the yellow was a smaller square. He tasted iron again, and the taste held to his tongue. Then he turned toward the corrals as if the day had work he could already name. The road out of Coldwater Bend climbed slow through brush and rock, then shouldered into open. Ada felt each tilt of the wheel in her ribs. She kept count in her head, not of numbers now, but of faces. She set Thomas by the window, and Eliza where the sun would find her. She placed Abraham with the boy who looked toward sickness and made the strong boy hold both their gloves until warmth grew through wool. Ada spoke to the driver through the front slit. She asked nothing more than his name. "Hatcher," he said, squinting into the cold and leaning low over reins. He smacked the leaders and called them gentlemen to make a joke that did not land. By 9, the sky was a faded steel. 30 minutes later, the wind lifted a loose drift and threw it across the trace like a sheet. The first hit took the breath from the mules. They sucked air and showed white eyes. Hatcher cursed for the first time that day, soft and afraid of his own voice. The weather changed shape and became a wall. Snow did not fall so much as race parallel to the ground. The coach shuddered. The canvas on the freight wagon snapped with a sound like a sail punching back against a mast. Voss yelled at a teamster to haul the line tighter, and the teamster yelled back that the line was ice. Inside the coach, the children went very still. Their quiet was heavy as blankets. Ada put her palm up where they all could see it. "We breathe on the same count," she said. 4 in, 4 out. Keep your mittens up. We do not wipe the frost from our lashes. we leave it be. Thomas grinned at the rule as if it were a trick, and did exactly what she said. The smallest girl's lips went pale. Ada took the girl's hands and rubbed them in her own until the skin squeaked under wool. Hatcher hauled back on the brake at a bad pitch, and the coach slid a foot sideways. The yellow panel scraped a rock and shaved paint the size of a coin. The mules screamed and tried to sit. Boone whooped something that he meant as courage, and then coughed on the shard of ice that cut his throat raw. The pass narrowed. Rock came up close on both sides and made a throat. The wind found that shape and joyed in it. It shoved at them. It set its shoulder and did not get tired. Men bent into it and could not make their legs go how they asked. Ada leaned out the slit again and said, "We need to stop the children from sleeping." Hatcher nodded without turning. He had ice in his eyelashes and could not feel his lips. Ada made her voice a song that stayed low in the body. She gave them a tune they knew with easy words and a rise that made breath a metronome. "Oh, Susanna," she said, and the coach learned how to sing around chattering teeth. A shape bulged out of the white to the right and then became a chimney of stone. The rest of the structure was gone. Only low walls and a black mouth, where the fire had been years back, remained. Voss saw it and stabbed a finger toward it. There. Boone waved his arm and then dropped it because the wind took his sleeve like it wished to yank it out of his coat. He called the line to a stop by yelling the names of the animals. Names cut the white better than orders. The first freight wagon groaned and came around its rear wheels so close to the drop that a teamster spat black and looked away from his own hands. They dragged people out of seats and into the cut. The low wall on the windward side gave them one small grace. It took the first shove from the north and broke it into pieces. The rest still came. It crawled under collars and through seams. It put knives in noses and ears. Someone tried a fire. The wood would not catch. It smoked and spat at their eyes. Ada bent to it and learned the smoke. She set the smallest children behind the taller ones and used bodies as shields while she coaxed flame from damp tinder with the patience she used on letters when letters would not line up for a boy. Hatcher stumbled around the ruin and came back with 2 broken chair legs and a handful of straw that had not seen sun in a decade. It was enough. A ribbon of fire crawled along the straw and found the chair legs and then committed itself little by little. Boone put his back to the stone and tried to count heads and lost the number twice. Voss demanded to know where a sack of flour had gone, and the man he asked only stared through him with tears frozen flat on his cheeks. The storm did not have edges. It had pressure. It pressed until it felt like the day thinned and the world lost depth. The mules stood in a row and shook. One dropped to its knees and then fought back up with a sound no one in that camp would forget. Ada moved through that sound with her hand to shoulders and faces telling names back to children so they would stay in their bodies. She found Rourke's blankets in the coach boot and dragged them to the ruin. She wrapped 2 around the smallest girl and 1 over Thomas's shoulders. She put the last one around herself and then took it off and put it around the boy whose skin had gone the color of ashes. She lifted her head and listened. The wind had a different note here. A higher pitch braided through the main roar. It scraped along stone and across old mortar, and it sounded like wire. She thought of the telegraph song in town and of a man who had told no one a weather report and still paid for weather all the same. The day fell under the weight. Light did not leave. It flattened. The fire made a little room that smelled of old ash and wet wool. They huddled inside that room, and outside it, the white kept moving. There was no sense of time, and no measure that felt true except breath and the next hand to warm and the next face to call back by name. Smoke from the poor fire hung low and mean. It stung the eyes and crowded the throat. The ruin held heat the way a cracked cup holds water, enough to wet the lips, never enough to drink. A shape stood at the cut where white kept shoving through. For a blink it looked like a drift turned wrong. Then it moved with intent. Ice glazed the hat, the shoulders the beard. Cole Mercer stepped inside the low walls and shook once, a dog's shake, and brought snow down in handfuls. No one spoke. Voss fixed him with a look that had knives in it but no grip. Boone's mouth opened and made a word that did not get out. Ada felt the children pull closer to her without being told. Cole set his bag down by the dead stones and squatted by the smoking fire. He studied the way the smoke ran along the floor before it found the slant of air. He shifted 2 bricks with his bare fingers and dug a shallow trench that drew from the coals to the cow where the wind took its bite. The smoke lifted a degree. It was not mercy, it was less punishment. "You will quit breathing if you stay like this," he said. His voice was rough as a rasp and quiet. That got their attention better than a shout. Boone stepped toward him like a man reclaiming ground. "I got this," he said. "We got this. We just need the wind to lay." Cole looked at the man's lashes hard with ice. He looked at the set of his hands. Then he looked past him to the freight wagon half buried to the hub. He did not argue. He put his hand out to Ada and pointed with his chin toward the coach boot. "Blankets," he said. "Any canvas. Axes." Ada went. She did not ask who had put him in charge. She took 2 children with her for the weight and for the feeling of being useful. The boot coughed up the blankets Rourke had loaded, and a roll of tired canvas that had been patched more than once. She dragged them to the ruin. Cole nodded and turned to the men. "We need split wood, not rounds. Splits catch. The frame on the small Conestoga is good wood. Break it. Save the spokes." Voss stepped in shoulders forward. "That is my wagon." Cole met his eyes and said nothing. He lifted his hatchet and walked to the wagon. He set the edge to the strut and tapped first to find the grain. Then he drove the bit. The wood gave up on its own plan and became part of his. Zeke Talbot caught the boards as they came and leaned them against the stone. The sound of work changed the air. Men who had frozen in place in their own heads began to move. Cole took rope from his bag. It was a different rope than the rest, tight-laid, treated with no loose hair. He ran one end through a gap in the stone and around the freight wagon's sideboard. He set a clove hitch where a lazy knot had been, and then a trucker's hitch to pull the canvas tight over their heads. He set an alpine butterfly halfway along so he could take a strain without walking back to the ends. He handed the freetail to Zeke. "Hold that. Feel it. When the gust hits you, take in a hand. If you let it creep, we lose the roof." Zeke nodded and wrapped the rope across his back and under one arm. He planted his boots like a stump. Cole pulled the padded coach seats and stripped them of tacks. He laid the padding along the stone so small bodies would not sit on ice and pretend it was a floor. He set the freight wagon as the wind wall and built from it a low lean-to, the canvas over top boards for ribbing spokes for braces. He moved without waste. He spent each step like coin. He spoke to the men in statements. He did not say please. He did not say trust me. He let a good knot and a tight sheet of canvas do the talking. Ada brought the children under the new low roof. The fire drew better now that the smoke had a path. It still bit. It choked less. That was victory in this place. She lined the smallest in the back against the freight wall. She put the stronger ones by the opening to feed the flames and hold the line of rope when Cole called for hands. Hatcher came with a box from the wreck of a trunk. It held a twist of tea and a tin cup and a small roll of sugar that had melted and set once a year for 10 years. Ada made a water sweet enough to count as a memory of sweetness. She wet lips and tongues and let the cup go to the next hands. Cole left the shelter and came back with an armful of branch and bark. He set the green parts aside and peeled the rough outer layer from a strip of pine. The inner flesh came up pale and almost translucent. He cut it fine with his knife. He did it in the open where the children could see. "This is cambium," he said. "Tree bread. It is food the tree keeps close. It is not much." Thomas looked at the slivers and at Ada. She lifted her chin once. He took the strip and chewed. He made a face because it tasted like green and smoke and bitterness. He swallowed and waited to feel if it would turn to strength. One by one he fed the children. He made the older ones give the first slivers to the smaller. He gave the mothers a few more. He kept none in his hand when the cut pieces were gone. He looked at the tree he had stripped and at the children's eyes, and then he went for more. Boone tried to restart his command. He began to tell men to stand here to carry that, to fetch something the storm had hidden. Cole said, "Hold the canvas," and the man held the canvas. Authority moved to the voice that made the shelter stand up. Ada watched the work and felt the smallness of herself and then the size of her use. She moved with rope tails and children's hands. She kept them awake. She set them tasks like small lights. You gather the chips. You count them. You keep your neighbor's hat down over his ears. She made a game of it. She did not clap when they did it right. She said their names like prayers with the answer built in. Voss stood off to the side and cradled his bad arm like a complaint he was nursing. He watched the bag Cole had brought and counted what might be in it that had not been given yet. His eyes were thin and bright. Ada saw the look and felt a flint strike in her. Cole reworked it the fire pit again, laying flat stones to make a throat that sent the smoke toward the low. He used mud from under the snow to seal gaps. He pulled the canvas lower and let the wind run over it instead of into it. The world outside hissed and howled. Inside there was a humming from breath and from rope drawn tight and eased and drawn tight again. He crouched by the opening and looked at the line of mules. Their hides were caked white. One shook, and the shake ran through it like a wave and did not reach the head. He went to the nearest and put his hand to the cheek palm flat. He spoke a nothing sound. The mule brought an ear to him and then set it back. He slipped a ration of mule grain he had carried in the bottom of his bag into the mouth. It was nothing. It told the animal it had not been forgotten. Ada lifted a blanket to show him, the hands of the smallest girl. Fingers like sticks, nails blue. He took the girl's hands in both of his and rubbed hard from knuckle to wrist, then pressed her fingers between his own to hold heat there. He looked at Ada. "Move them," he said. "Make them kick their feet. If they sleep, they go under." Ada made the children stamp. She called it soldier steps and did not say why the word came to her. She hummed time, and the firelight made lanterns of their faces. Snow carved around the ends of the stone wall and blew into drifts that took the shape of whatever it landed on. It made ghosts of the men standing at the edge and then erased those ghosts and drew new ones. The sky had gone from steel to a white that hurt the brain. Cole went to the edge of the lean-to and peered into that. He listened. The wind had a high note in it that it had not had the day he was born. He touched his scar and felt the small pull. He did not taste iron now. He had already tasted it and made his choices. The children grew louder because loud felt like life. Their breath made fog, and the fog rose to the canvas and turned to frost. Ada wiped it with her sleeve, and it came right back. She stopped wiping and warmed another pair of hands. Hatcher crouched by the fire with his hat in his lap. He reminded himself of his name by saying it under his breath. Boone made a pile of things to count, and then forgot how to number beyond 2. Voss paced the short space and grinned sometimes to himself. Zeke held the rope with his back and looked solid as a gatepost driven to bedrock. Cole took the knife again and cut more pine. He put cambium into mouths. He took the seat paddings and arranged them in a way that made a little wall that reflected heat. He moved a child 2 feet and bought her another hour without frostbite. He did not look bigger than he had in the livery. He did not look smaller either. He looked like a man who knew what a rope will do when you ask it right and what a fire needs when the air hates it. The wind hit hard and the canvas bowed. Zeke took a hand in and braced a boot and grunted through his teeth. The knot held. The hitch held. The roof stayed. Ada met Cole's eyes across the dim. She had smoke in hers and something else. She nodded once like 2 people do when the words in the room would only break the good of the work. Cole nodded back and then looked at the next piece of the day that would ask for hands. Night took the light and left a kind of gray that slept with its eyes open. The lean-to held. The rope hummed in gusts. Snow kept its hands on the canvas and tried to pull it away like a thief tugging a coat. The fire was a string of coals. Ada worked the air with a tin lid, coaxing flame with patience. Smoke crawled across the floor stones and found the trench Cole had scraped. It bent and went low toward the bite of wind. The children sang under their breath to keep lungs awake. The notes were thin and stubborn. Cole counted the bodies by shadows. He watched for the slack shape that meant someone had gone still in a way that was not sleep. He moved from face to face and let his hand tell him heat or cold. Zeke held his place by the rope and rolled his shoulders when the canvas bowed. The youngest of the mothers had the baby under her coat. She held it up against her skin where heat was most fierce. She rocked because rocking is what you do when there is nothing else to give. The tiny mouth worked with no sound. The eyes were closed. The little hands were fists the size of marbles. Ada saw the mother's face go flat in a way that was not anger. She moved to her. She lifted the edge of the coat and set 2 fingers against the soft neck. Then she put her ear where the heart would knock. Her own breath made noise that got in the way. She held it. She listened. She lifted the baby to the fire and gave heat to its feet with both palms. She said the name into the small ear as if the name could fetch the child back. The mother made a sound that was older than speech. Jonah Ward took his hat off and did not know why. He held it with 2 hands in his lap, like it was a bowl with something holy in it. Cole stood at the edge of the light and set his jaw. He moved so the wind would not blow into the fire, while Ada finished what there was to finish. The mother's eyes found the dark past the fire and did not see it. Ada wrapped the baby in a blanket and tied it with a length of rope she had cut from a useless halter. The knot was a square one, neat 2 turns, no slip. She gave it to Jonah. He did not take it. He could not yet. She set it in his lap and closed his fingers around the small weight. His hands knew how to hold. They learned again. No one talked about it. The sound the storm made took their words and ground them down to grit. Riley Voss had been watching hunger chew holes in him. He watched it chew holes in other people too, and liked it less in himself. He saw Jonah's lap. He saw the sack that the Wards had kept tight to their feet under the bench. He moved in while the grief was loud. He towed the sack and felt the give of flour. He put his boot on it and pushed it out of the shadow. He made his voice a low growl that he thought would keep it just between them. Share it out, Ward. Jonah looked up through a mask of salt and frost. It is for her, he said. He did not look at his wife. He looked into Voss's chest like the answer might be there. For her, nothing, Voss said. His good hand went to his belt and found the skinning knife that always sat there. He did not lift it yet. He let the idea of it do some of the work. Ada stood up with the baby's empty blanket still warm in her hands. She took 2 steps and set herself between the children and the men without making a show of it. She did not speak. Her face did not try to be kind. Boone Kearney turned his head to watch and could not seem to stand up. The storm had worked a hook into the meat of him, and he had not found the strength to pull it. Cole walked to them. He did not hurry. He did not measure distance in strides so much as in what needed to change before the next breath. He looked once at the knife he knew would come out, and then at Voss's feet. Voss kept his knees too straight when he was sure of himself. It would make him slow in certain turns. Cole put that away. Voss smiled with one side of his mouth. He lifted the knife enough to show tool and not yet weapon. He flicked his eyes at Ada and then at the sack again. Do not make me beg, Cole said wryly, and then he was on Voss's wrist with his left hand thumb driven hard into the soft, just under the knob of bone. He turned Voss's hand palm up and stepped in so the knife had no swing. He set his knee to Voss's hip and leaned his weight the way you lean on a stubborn gate. The joint went away. Joints do not want to go. The sound was quiet, like a branch giving up in deep snow. Voss cried out, and the knife dropped from his fingers. Cole kicked the knife toward the trench. It skidded and lay there a black thought in the half-light. Voss hit him with the shoulder that would still move. The 2 men came against the freight wall and the canvas at once. The roof trembled. Zeke hauled the rope, and the knot held. Voss got his good hand to the knife with a scramble that made more noise than it should have. He came up and drove it in a hooking line meant for guts. Cole saw the blade too late to be safe and got his right hand in the way. The edge bit from the heel of his palm toward the base of his finger. It was a deep cut. Blood came out fast and smart, like it had been waiting at the door. Cole shut Voss down with an elbow to the jaw and took him to the ground. He stripped the knife with a twist and sent it to the far corner. Voss curled around his arm and made an animal sound. He would have made worse if Zeke had not taken him by the shoulders and walked him back to the wall and set him there like a sack of feed with teeth. Ada had already knelt. She set Cole's hand over the coals so the blood would show her the shape of the wound. He did not pull away. He made his breath go slow and even and listened to her voice. She did not speak to him. She spoke to herself. She ripped a clean strip from the inside hem of her dress, where the fabric would not show its absence until spring. She poured the whiskey from her small flask into the tin cup and warmed it with a hand over the fire to blunt the shock. She looked once at Cole's eyes. He inclined his head and did not look away. She poured the whiskey into the cut. His body arched and then came back to still. The smell of it rose sharp and sweet over the smell of pine smoke and wet wool. Hold, she said. He held. She threaded a needle with black thread because it would show against the skin and she would know where each stitch lay. Her hands were steady because that is what hands do when children are watching them. She took the edges of his flesh and set them together like he was a torn sleeve. The needle went in and came out and made a simple ladder. She did not talk. She put each stitch where it belonged. Voss watched from the wall, with his bad arm clutched to him and his teeth bared. He stared past the pain at the sack of flour, as if hate could move it without his hand. Boone finally stood up. He stood because the room had chosen, and he had not been part of the choosing. He stared at the knife in the corner and felt the heat of shame rise through the cold. Ada tied the last knot. She built a bandage from the cleanest cloth left. She wrapped the hand and tied in a square knot that would not slip. She pressed his fingers to make sure blood still moved where it needed to. Cole lowered his head and looked at her from under the brim of his hat. "Thank you," he said. It came out like the sound a boot sole makes when it lifts from frozen mud. She nodded and put her needle back in the tin. She capped the flask with flat with the last of the whiskey and set it at the back of the fire, as if it might turn into more if you were kind to it. Cole stood and went to the opening of the lean-to. He sat with his back against the stone and his bad hand in his lap. He became a door. Wind hit him first and lost the sharpest teeth on him. He did not move when the canvas flapped. He watched the white and let his eyes rest on the place where shapes would appear, if shapes ever meant to appear. Ada kept the children awake. She set them to rubbing each other's hands and feet. She had them count breaths again. She made them tell her the letters of their names, and then the letters of the names of the ones next to them. She made the older girl teach the smaller boy the shape of a capital S with mittened fingers on a plank. Zeke tended the rope and fed the fire with boards from Voss's wagon while Voss watched. Zeke did not make a ceremony of it. He put wood where wood belonged. He looked over at Jonah and nodded once. Jonah lifted the little wrapped weight and pressed it to his chest and closed his eyes. Boone tried to apologize to no one in particular, and his mouth would not form the words. Hatcher carried snow for water without being asked until his shoulders shook from it. The work kept him inside his body. The storm filled the ruin with noise and a kind of silence. The quiet was a place inside each person that would not answer when called. Ada moved between faces and knocked on doors that looked shut. She called names into ears and had the names come back to her. She watched the little girl with blue nails start to pink at the cuticle and felt a small lift in her chest. Cole sat and listened to the wire in his head. It sang like the telegraph line had sung that morning, high and thin. He tasted iron, and then the taste went out. He put his left hand on the stone and leaned into the cold until it told him what it would tell. He breathed in time with the rope creak and the fire's sigh. He made himself a weight that could not be moved without more force than the wind had to spare. Near midnight, the canvas tore at a corner where a knot had slipped. Zeke did not feel it first. The sound changed, and the cold came sharper. Cole was already moving. He rolled to his knees, braced his shoulder into the flap, and caught the loose edge with his left hand. He tied a hitch one-handed and made it tidy. He took a short length from his bag and set a second knot through a reinforced grommet he had stitched there with wax thread in some other winter. He tested both with his weight. The canvas flattened. The roof held its breath and then breathed again. Ade met him back at the fire and showed him the smallest boy's feet. The skin had gone waxy. Cole warmed his palms and pressed them to the little arches. He rubbed life into them with the attention he gave to a horse he meant to ride in ice. He looked at Ada once and saw the grit around her eyes. He saw the way she never put both hands down at once. He saw she was as tired as a person can be and still be standing. The child made a sound when heat found him. It was not pretty, it was right. Outside the lean-to, the wind kept its work. Inside, breath and rope and fire kept theirs. Cole did not speak again before dawn. Ada did not sit. Zeke did not let the rope creep a finger's width. Voss did not look away from the sack of flour for more than the time it takes to blink. Boone stood and then sat and stood again. Hatcher carried snow. Jonah held the bundle in his lap and stared at the top seam of the blanket as if it were a road. The night hung on them. It did not lift. It thinned here and there enough to see the faces you needed to see. It gave them a little room to keep going inside of. It let the knots bite and hold. It let the small fire lick along the split wood and make a sound like a whisper you could almost understand. Morning was not light. It was a thicker gray that let faces show through the smoke. The fire had learned its way in the trench Cole scraped. It drew enough to keep flame from sulking. The canvas roof clicked as Frost took it and let it go. Riley Voss had slept some with his back to the stone and his arm cradled like a broken bird. He woke mean. Hunger woke with him. He stared at the sack by Jonah Ward's boots and then at the bag by Cole's knee. He counted with his eyes and did not like the numbers. Boone Kearney stood and could not figure where to put his hands. He put them behind his back as if a parade might go by and need saluting. He did not meet anyone's eyes. Hatcher stacked snow in a pot and watched it surrender to steam. His mouth moved around a prayer that did not know its own words. Cole checked the knots. He pressed a thumb into the clove hitch and felt the bite. He tightened a tug where the canvas had settled. He watched Zeke roll his shoulders and swap the rope to the other hip. The big farmer looked like a gate braced into stone. Ada Whitfield pulled her gloves off and put them under the smallest girl's feet to warm. She worked the child's toes between her palms to bring color back. She looked around to find Thomas watching her and gave him a job that would matter. Count the breaths with me. Do not tell anyone the number. The storm had not quit. It had shifted its weight. The sound had lowered. It felt like the wind had moved one street over and was now working a different door. Voss pushed off the wall and shook his bad hand to make it look useful. He found a smile and fitted it on his face. He chose his place near the fire where everyone would hear him without looking like he was making a speech. "We got a drifter telling us where to set our own wood," he said. His tone was almost friendly, almost. "I say a man says little because he got something big he will not say." Boone flinched at the word drifter like it had been meant for him. He glanced at Cole and then at Ada. Jonah stared down. Zeke looked at the rope and not at Voss at all. Ade felt the shift the way a horse feels a rider tighten for a jump. She stood. She smoothed her skirt that was already creased and dirty and made the fabric mind her again. Cole knelt by the fire and held his stitched hand above the coals. He did not speak. He watched the children's shoulders for the telltale slump. He listened for the breaths that got too slow. Voss tipped his head toward the scar at Cole's neck. That mark says he got a story. He could share it if he had a mind. Yet here he is, quiet as a coyote around a hen house. No one laughed. Snow fretted at the canvas and the rope sang once and settled. "Ada," said Mr. Voss. She did not follow it with a question. She kept the space after the name empty and made him fill it. He made his smile smaller. "I got a right to know who is taking charge of my life, of my team, of that boy's life with his bloom gone out of his cheeks." Boone found his voice at last. Let him speak. His own voice surprised him with how thin it was. Cole lifted his eyes. He had not planned to feed anyone words. He planned rope and wood and heat and minutes. He looked at Ada. She met him and did not tell him what to do. That felt like trust, not pressure. Cole stood and let his height be. He set his shoulders where they belonged. He held his bandaged hand against his stomach to quiet the throb. He did not clear his throat. He let the gravel in it do its own work. "I rode scout," he said. "Fifth Cavalry. Up and down country that had more names than maps had room for. I learned wind and stone and how a trail talks if you shut up and listen. I learned knots from men who tied their lives to a rope and did not have room for pretty." Hatcher blinked at the number, as if it were a prayer come back with new clothes. Boone leaned in. Voss's smile went away and then came back wrong. Cole looked at the wall beyond the fire and saw a winter that was not this one. On a ridge a captain had pointed where no man should go and called it courage. I was told to ride men into a cut like this with a storm on our backs. I said no. I was called a coward and worse. The shot that made this mark came from a hand that had eaten from my fire. He touched his neck with 2 fingers and let them fall. Zeke's jaw worked, then set. Jonah stared at the blanket in his lap. Hatcher looked at his hands like they were a pair he had borrowed. Voss let the quiet sit until it felt like something unsteady. Then he stepped into it. A soldier who will not go where he is told. He made his voice almost soft. "Not one of us either way." He looked at Cole's hair at his cheekbones. The wind had carved at eyes that did not fit any town he had lived in. He made his words carry more than sound. "Folks back in Coldwater," he said, "did not much know where to put you. Hard to put you in any of the boxes." Ada stepped forward until she and Cole were tree and shadow in the same patch of light. She set her hand on Cole's good shoulder and let it rest there. The room saw the touch and learned what it meant. Her voice did not reach for height. It went low and precise. "He took a knife meant for me and for a sack of flour," she said. "He gave his rope. He gave the blankets you see around your children. He tied this roof into the wind, and it is not gone. If you think the boxes matter more than the knots you are cold in, a way a fire will not fix." Boone looked down and then up and then down. Hatcher nodded without knowing he had. Jonah held the small bundle tighter. Zeke did not change at all. He already had the measure of things. Voss shifted to anger because shame itched, and he did not know how to scratch it. He jabbed a finger at Cole. "He called me by my given name like we were friends," he said. "He thinks he can run this show without saying what else he runs." Cole turned to the freight wagon and put a palm to its plank, as if testing grain. He spoke to the room without looking at Voss. "We cannot lay here and wait. The wind will shift, and the cold will take fingers and then hands." He looked back now. "We move when there is lull enough to do it, without dying in 3 steps." Voss heard the word move and thought he had his chance. Move where? Into white. After who? Ada's palm pressed into Cole's shoulder once and let go. She turned to the children. She set them to rubbing hands again. She gave them the song with new breath under it. She gave the room a rhythm that was not panic. Boone dragged the small Conestoga board pile toward the center. Zeke was there already. He had taken a seat cover and stripped it. He pulled the padding and shook the tacks into a tin. The sound was like sleet on a pan. Cole uncoiled his rope and measured with his hands. He made a loop big as a small wrist and tied a knot that would not cinch. He made another and another until the rope had a line of circles like a paper chain. He held the first loop out to Thomas and let the boy put it over his mitten and feel the pull. The boy grinned like he had been handed a magic he could understand. Ada looked at the line and saw the telegraph wire in the town street and the bell rope in the church. She touched the second loop and felt the twist and lay. She set the names in her head to the order of loops and told no one. Voss saw the rope become decision and spat on the floor. He stepped toward the flour sack as if any move at all would feel like power. Zeke stepped into his path and did not say anything. There are doors a man learns not to try. Hatcher brought a sleeve of canvas and set it down. He looked at Cole like a student who had walked back in after a long absence. "What do you need?" His voice did not shake now. Cole pointed with his left hand. "Boards here for runners. Wrap the noses with canvas so they ride on crust. Lash with short lengths, not long. Long creeps, short holds." Boone made a sound like he was about to argue, then hooked his head and got on with it. His hands remembered how to be useful. That memory fed him a little. Ada crouched by Jonah and Eliza. She did not touch the bundle. She rested her finger on Eliza's sleeve. "We will carry her," she said. The voice was matter of fact. Eliza lifted her eyes. They were empty, and then the emptiness cracked. She nodded once. She took Jonah's wrist and held it, and let go and held it again. Cole worked the lashings. He set 3 braces under each runner and tied each with a hitch that would lock under strain and release when asked. He pulled on the line and made the wood sing a low note that meant tight enough. Voss drifted to the edge of light like a shadow that wanted to be a wall. He stared into the white and tried to see an end. He could not. He told himself he was looking for a break in weather. He was looking for a way to make himself bigger than he felt. Hatcher brought out a coil of mule tack rope. Cole cut it to lengths with his knife and set the ends with a match so they would not fray. He tossed a short piece to Zeke, who caught it with a carpenter's hands, and set about making a harness that would not bite the shoulders it touched. Ada stood the children in a row and checked each face for the telltale look that means sleep will steal you in minutes. She took a girl's chin and lifted it, and looked into those eyes and set the chin down with a little reassurance. She adjusted a cap and pulled mittens up over wrists. She told each child a secret. The secret was the child's own name spoken with care. Boone pulled a plank across the stone to make the floor more itself. He pulled it straight and true and sat back on his heels. His breath smoked. He did not cough. He looked up at Cole like a man finding a star he thought had moved. The rope of loops lay in a coil with the circles neat and even. Ada picked it up and felt the weight. She mapped the line across the length of the lean-to and put Thomas at the front and Eliza in the warm of the middle, and the smallest girl behind Ada where hands could reach. She did not say why she chose that order. Cole checked his hand, and the stitch line did not leak. He could make a fist, and he could not grip a hammer. He would make do with what he had. He set his hat down tighter. He felt for the taste of iron and did not find it just then. The air smelled of smoke and pine and damp wool. Hatcher set the pot by the coals and scraped the bottom for the last sweet of heat. He handed the tin to Ada. She tipped it to each mouth. Sugar tea water smoke. The drink drew the children back to themselves long enough to finish their tasks. Zeke lifted one sled by himself and found the balance. He looked to Cole and waited for a point. Cole pointed and Zeke set it there as if lines on a floor could be roads already. Voss hugged his bad arm to his chest and watched a plan become a thing you could touch. He made his face blank so the room would not read him. He made his eyes small. He stopped talking. Ada tied the loop line to her belt. She took in the slack and felt the pull of 10 small weights. She breathed once deep and let it out slow. She met Cole's eye and nodded so small it was mostly for her and a little for him. The canvas ticked again. The rope hummed in a gust. The lean-to held its shape. The fire licked along 2 new splits and found its old voice. Snow worried at the edges and then settled. Inside the low roof, people checked buckles and knots and the fit of mittens and the lay of hats. They did not say what any of it meant. They made it true with hands. The storm stepped down a measure, not quiet, a lessened push. The rope on the roof hummed a lower note. Men lifted their heads like cattle catching scent. Cole listened with his whole body and then said, "Now." They opened the canvas at the lee side. Air bit at their teeth. Cole brought the Mustang cross they had taken from the corral, a dark, narrow horse with a stubborn light in his eye. Someone had called him Jackstraw once, and the name fit. Cole set the lead in his left hand and took the first steps into the white. The horse put his nose to the wind and found a slow rhythm. He broke a path that did not waste legs. Ada tied the line of loops to her belt and spread the children along it. Mittens found circles. 10 small pulls laid against her hips like heartbeats. Eliza Ward walked close enough to feel Ada's coat. Thomas set himself at the head of the children and watched the back of Cole's boots like they were the only tracks that mattered. Zeke and Boone shoved the 2 sleds into place behind the line. Voss got himself onto one with a hiss through his teeth and a smirk that said he had won some small thing. On the other sled, Mrs. Talbot lay wrapped in a quilt that had not been warm for 2 days. Zeke bent to her and touched his forehead to hers. He said her given name and let it hold in his mouth. Hatcher took the rear and put his hands on the sled ropes. He set his stance the way he set his team on a slope. He did not talk. The work sat better in him than deciding had. They moved. The lean-to fell behind them, and the ruin of stone became a pale shape they could not see once they turned their heads. The white ate edges. The trail had become a memory of a trail. Cole read it in rock that sundered through drifts in the way snow scalloped out from the windward side of a boulder and piled deep in the lee. He tested each step. He found where crust would hold and where it would break and take a man hip deep. The wind came in bursts and then eased and then pressed again. It made a low moan in the cuts of the rock and a thin cry along the horse's bridle rings. The children breathed in time with Ada's count. 4 in, 4 out. She kept her voice close to the body. She did not throw sound into the wind. She saved it for ears. Thomas slipped once to his knee and came up hard. Cole looked back and lifted 2 fingers and lowered them. Slow. Thomas nodded and swallowed the hurry that jittered in his legs. The white opened for a few steps and showed a lip where the land fell away. Ada kept the rope taut and walked it like a seam. The sled behind her snagged, and Zeke put a shoulder into it and eased it over. Voss cursed at the jolt. Zeke did not answer because the answer was already in the rope he pulled. Arlen Price dragged himself at the very back. He had kept to the freight wagon in the ruin, and now he kept to the edge of the line as if distance might make him grander. He let his feet slide, and then he sat. He sat as if the ground had asked him tenderly to rest. Hatcher called his name and got no answer. Cole came back along the line, his steps sure in the path he had set. He stopped over Arlen and waited for the man to look up. Arlen did not. He kept his eyes on his knees like they were all that was left of him. "Get up," Cole said. "Go to hell," Price said without heat. He tipped his head back and let the snow land on his face. Cole took Arlen's blanket. He did it clean. He folded it once and hooked it over his arm. Then he looked at the man as if Arlen had asked for a judgment, and Cole had decided. "Then die," Cole said. He turned and walked back through the white. Hatcher stood there and did not argue. He had felt that choice in himself and put it away before it woke. The line moved on. The land narrowed, and the rock came up on both sides. The wind used the walls to drive them harder. Jackstraw heaved and set his feet and pulled them 1 more yard. The rope line tugged against Ada's waist like a live thing. She took the tug and sent steadiness back along it with her body. The children answered with every step. Midday was a lighter shade of gray. The sun was somewhere in it, a smudge that told no truth. Cole fed the horse a palm of oats from the small cloth bag in his coat. He spared the animal the time and the food and spared nothing else. He looked into the white and found nothing but more white. He set his jaw and went. Mrs. Talbot coughed once. It was a small sound tucked under the wind. Zeke felt it through the sled rope. He did not turn. He did not dare stop on that stretch. 20 yards later, the rope went lighter. Zeke stopped dead. The sled came forward with less weight than it should have. He moved to the front of the sled and pulled back the quilt. Her face had a quiet you do not get in life. Snow feathered the ends of her hair. He set his hand on her cheek with the tenderness a big man keeps hidden until the day demands it. He leaned in and kissed her forehead. Then he took his knife and cut the lashings clean. He pushed the sled to the side where the wall fell away and eased it down. He did not watch it go. He stood a breath, 2 breaths, and then he took the rope of the children from Ada, without asking, and put himself at the front with her. His face was a door shut to everything but forward. Ada put her hand to his elbow for that one moment, and then let go. She turned to Eliza Ward and pulled the woman into her with an arm. Eliza's body shook once and then steadied. She kept her place on the line. Jonah came forward and put his hand on Zeke's shoulder and squeezed and then fell back to guard the children at the middle. The land laid a long slope ahead. The crust went bad under the first 3 steps. Cole angled to the right and found a rib of rock under the drift. He walked it like a beam. Jackstraw's hooves hit rock with that reassuring ring that means there is something under the world. They crossed that rib one by one, Cole pointing with 2 fingers where to place each boot and each sled runner. Voss moaned again when his sled bumped. Zeke did not hear him, or said he did not. He dragged the weight like it was a sack of grain he had been hauling since spring. Ada kept the count for the children and felt the numbers make a path in her own head. She watched Thomas blow frost off his lip and grin at nothing, and then bite his lip to hold courage in place. She tucked the smallest girl's scarf closer to the little cheeks and felt cold through the wool onto her own fingers. Afternoon found a ragged ledge that gave them a pause. The rock scooped out a shallow bowl and broke the wind. Cole set the horse under the lip and loosened the cinch one hole to let ribs fill and empty. He took out the handful of oats that remained and crossed palms with the animal again. The horse chewed and breathed steam onto Cole's wrist. Cole pressed his forehead to the horse's cheek and closed his eyes for the length of one breath. Zeke dropped to a knee at the edge of the bowl and let his arms hang. His shoulders shuddered once and went quiet. Ada eased the children into the shallow shelter and put their backs to rock that held a little sun deep in it. She made them clap hands 5 times, then 10, then hold hands under their own arms. She pulled Voss's sled into the lee and covered him to mid-chest because men grow worse when pain and pride sit together in wind. Boone found his knees and then his feet, and then found a dead branch lodged in a crack. He worked it with numb fingers and brought it back like spoils. Hatcher took it and shaved curls with the back of his knife and built a flame small as a candle. It was enough to set one more split to catch. The smoke crawled over the rock and did not lie down on their lungs. Ade took Thomas's face in her hands and blew into her gloves and pressed the warm wool to his ears. Thomas laughed with his eyes. He looked over her shoulder at Cole and tried to copy the way a man sets his mouth when he carries weight. The face looked wrong on him and then almost right. Cole sat with his back to the rock and eased his bandaged hand onto his thigh. The stitches held. The pain was a clean throb that meant flesh still argued. He closed his eyes and felt the wind scrape the rock above them. He could hear the telegraph wire in his head again, that fine high song that had come off the town street. He opened his eyes and saw Ada watching the children as if names were ropes and she had tied each one to her belt. She slid down beside him without ceremony and put her shoulder to his. For a brief time their warmth pooled between coats. They did not speak. The quiet had weight and rightness. Ada looked at his stitched hand, and then at the horse, and then at the children, and then back to his face. He did not ask what she saw. She turned her head and watched the snow drift along the lip like sand in wind. Her breath slowed until it matched his. Hatcher came near and handed them the tin, with the last of the hot water colored by bark. Ada tipped it and shared the swallow with Cole. He swallowed and held the heat in his mouth a second longer than needed, then let it go. The lull thinned. The wind pulled at the edge of the bowl like a polite stranger deciding whether to knock. Cole slid forward on his boots and stood. He set the cinch and checked the rope at Ada's belt. He looked into the white and found the next shape of a bend. He did not say what he saw. He set a hand on Zeke's shoulder and felt the hard answer there. Zeke nodded without looking up. Ada raised the rope and the children took their loops again. She met each pair of eyes and set them back into themselves with their proper names. She touched Eliza's sleeve and Jonah's wrist. She tugged Thomas's mitten and watched him roll his shoulders like he thought he had some of Zeke in him now. They moved off the ledge. Jackstraw stepped into the drift and shouldered a furrow. Cole followed his feel of the land and found a line. The rope drew tight at Ada's hips and then settled. The sleds cut thin tracks into the crust with a whisper like paper. Snow pressed in on either side and then fell back. They put their heads down and their hands up, and the cold took what it could and left the rest. The gorge tightened until rock on the left brushed sleeves and rock on the right took hats. Jackstraw blew and set his feet wider. The wind made a long, low note that lifted hair on the neck. Then the sound changed. It thickened from a moan to a thing you could feel in boot soles. Cole lifted his hand. Stop. Adai felt the rope at her waist go still and the 10 small pulls settle into her hips. Zeke froze with the sled line across his chest. Boone lifted his head like he had heard a drum far off. The rumble swelled. The wall above to the right cracked in a thin, ugly way. Cole pointed down with his palm flat. Against the rock. Cover your heads. They folded into the stone. Ada pulled the rope of loops in tight and wrapped 2 children with her own arms. Zeke pulled Mrs. Talbot's empty sled in hard and made his body a roof over Eliza and Jonah for that breath. Hatcher crouched and put his shoulder against Voss's sled and turned his face to rock. The cornice let go. It did not fall as a sheet. It poured. Snow ice broken crust, fist-sized rock, all of it at once. It hit 30 yards ahead and erased the trail clean. The sound filled the gorge until air went thin. Snow dust billowed back and made a fog that tasted like cold chalk. The rush slid out of sight and left a new face to the ravine, a hard white wall where the path had been. The quiet after sounded wrong. The wind had lost a piece of itself. The children started whispering nonsense to make sound fill the gap. Ada checked their faces one by one, eyes big, skin raw, breathing fast, all present. Boone stood and spat into the snow and watched his spit freeze before it sank. "We are done," he said. He did not make it loud. He said it like a number he had counted true. Cole walked forward until his boots touched the new wall. It rose more than a man and then twice that. Packed ice and broken plates of snow welded to each other. No lines to use, no weakness that begged the hand. His stitched hand throbbed in time with his pulse. He set the pain aside with the same practice he used to set aside hunger. He pulled his coil of cavalry rope from his bag and put it into Zeke's big hands. "Hold this. If I fall, you do not lose your feet trying to catch me. You sit and lock and let the wall take me." Zeke wrapped the rope around his back and under his arm and set his boots wide. He did not say the word all right. He made his shoulders say it. He leaned back and made his body into a post. Cole took the hatchet from his belt and felt the haft settle into his palm. The edge had taken care that morning. It would take more now. He looked once to Ada. She had a hand on Eliza's sleeve and the other on the smallest girl's collar. She lifted her chin once and put strength in the look. He gave a small nod back and turned to the ice. He climbed. He set the first bite of steel to the wall and drove it with a short, sure knock. The hatchet sank and held. He pulled himself up to that and scraped for purchase with the edges of his boots. The ice did not welcome him. It assessed him. He put the hatchet in again a half arm's reach above. He did not swing like a man chopping wood. He placed, he set, he tested before he trusted. The rope came up behind him, paid out under Zeke's careful hands. Ada watched the line draw across Zeke's coat and darken with melt. She kept the children from looking up by keeping their eyes on her. "Name your letters," she said. She pointed to a plank and traced with a mitten. She did not look away from Cole for more than a blink. 10 feet. 15. The wall steepened and shifted. A plate broke under his boot and slid away with a soft hiss that made the gorge hold its breath. Cole dug with his toes to blue ice and set himself again. He pushed the hatchet in high and felt it bite shallow. He pulled against it and the ice cracked around the head. The tool came away and his body sagged an inch. He fed himself a breath. He found a seam and drove the bit there. Full bite. He moved. Halfway up, a slab lifted under his weight and tilted loose. He dropped a foot of purchase and swung, caught by his own left hand on the hatchet. The rope tightened across Zeke's back and burned a line into coat and shirt. Zeke sat into it and dug heels. The children made a sound that had no words. Ada did not. She put her mouth close to her scarf and squeezed her eyes shut once and then opened them again. Cole hung and did not look down. He let the first jolt wash through his arms. He used the swing to plant his boots against the face again. He jammed his right hand into a crack. The stitches pulled. The cut opened inside the bandage and warmth broke across his palm in a hot slick. He shut the pain in the old room in his head that held other pains. He did not knock on that door again. He went up. He reached the top and found an edge of wind-scoured rock under the ice. He hooked his elbow over it and pulled his ribcage over. He lay with his chest on the lip and his legs off and breathed in small sips until the world steadied. The rope lay across his hip like a hand. He rolled to his knees and took stock. The slide had left a perched ridge of packed snow and ice, a crest like the back of a sleeping animal. On the far side, the drop shelved down into the ravine. Not friendly, not impossible. He set the hatchet and cut a step into the crest, then another a foot below it. He worked a straight line down the face that looked toward his people, each step deep enough for the toe and the ball of a boot. He set his heel and tested. He cut handholds where a child might reach. The sound of hatchet on ice set a rhythm that made the air believe in work again. Thud, thud, thud. He did not count. He cut until his arm burned and then cut more. Zeke let the rope play out by inches. His shoulders shook and he set them still. Hatcher took the slack tail and kept it neat at Zeke's feet, a task that gave him purpose and a way to be needed. Boone stood and stared at the steps arriving, as if a man could make a staircase out of winter with his hands. Blood had soaked the bandage at Cole's palm and streaked the haft where his fingers gripped. It made his glove dark and sticky. He did not stop. He cut the last 3 steps and then braced the hatchet above his head and slid boots, finding the steps he had made, knees bent, body ready to catch a miss. He ran out of steps near the bottom and came the last 10 feet in a half fall. Zeke checked the rope and turned the fall into a rough landing instead of a tumble. Cole hit the snow hard and stayed on his feet long enough to get near Ada. Then his legs gave a little. Zeke and Ada grabbed his coat and held him upright. His breath came in ripped pieces. He nodded toward the wall. "Path," he said. His teeth clicked together twice with the cold. He did not go to the fire because there was no fire. There was only the wall and the white. He let Ada bind his hand tighter with the last clean cloth. She poured the thin warmth from the flask across the bandage, and he found an extra breath behind his eyes. She met his gaze and did not ask if he was done. He was not. They moved the rope to the first step. Cole took the front with jackstraw and put his boots where memory of his own cuts told him to. He shoved the hatchet in above and back to make a handle for himself and for the next. He left it there and reached for a seam. He made himself a ladder with few rungs and many promises. He spoke only when a foot went wrong. Left Thomas. Not there. Up a hand. Ada brought the children to the wall and set the first small boot into the first small step. She took Eliza's wrist and pressed it to the cut handhold. She moved each child up to the next hold before she took her own. The rope line tugged at her, and she tugged back a tide against a tide. Zeke crawled to the front of Mrs. Talbot's empty sled and anchored it with his body, while Boone and Hatcher lifted. They walked the sled up the first 4 steps with hands and knees and set it on the crest. Voss swore and breathed hard. He did not ask to be moved first. He understood his place when his life hung from other hands. Jackstraw climbed better than any man there. He placed each hoof into Cole's cuts and stood above them, with steam pouring off his flanks. His eyes showed white once and then settled. Cole spoke to him with sound that was not a word, and the horse answered with weight where weight was asked. They topped the crest 1 and 2 and 3 at a time. Children first in the line of loops, Ada in the middle where her voice could touch both ends, Zeke behind Boone, and Hatcher catching and setting and catching again. Cole stood at the top with his boots braced on bare rock. He leaned in and took elbows and forearms and wrists. He lifted with his left hand and set each small body onto the far slope where steps dropped away down the other side. He showed with a finger where to put a foot and then where to put the next. Ada came up onto the crest and turned to help the last 2 children past her. She saw the line they had come and the clean face the slide had left. She felt a sweep of cold and pride. She pressed her palm to Cole's arm without thinking. He did not look at her. He felt the touch and set the next child down safe, and then another. They lowered the sled with Voss in it, with a rope around the rear runners and 3 men holding. He bit back a noise when a runner bumped a step. He held it down with his breath and with his teeth. The sled reached the shelf below, and Zeke set it square. He did not look up to see who had watched him do it. He did not need applause. The far side fell hard. The steps Cole had cut were shallow here. The ice underneath them was older and meaner. The wind came up the slope instead of down. It went inside coats and pressed flat against bones. Cole took the lead again and moved in a way that told the others how to move. Quiet feet, low hips, no hurry. The count in Ada's mouth changed to match the shorter steps. The rope line across the children tugged and held and tugged again. Ada felt each pull and sent calm back with the set of her shoulders and the steadiness of her breath. Thomas had the good sense to be scared and the stubbornness to keep that fear in the part of him that made feet careful instead of wild. The smallest girl cried into her scarf without sound. Ada heard it and hummed and felt the small shoulders ease 1 notch. Cole reached the bottom of the cut steps and stood with his back to the wall while the last of them came down to him. His hand throbbed like a second heart. He kept it high and held his arm against his ribs to help the clot hold. Blood had soaked into the bandage and then frozen along the outside in a crust. He did not look at it. He looked at boots and toes and the places where a heel might slip if you tried to show off to yourself. They gathered on a narrow shelf where drifts had curled and soft as bread. The wind came past and did not hit as straight. They bent into each other and into the rock. Faces matched names again. Breath made a little cloud that drifted and broke. Cole put his forehead for a second to Jackstraw's cheek and closed his eyes. He ran his left hand down the horse's neck to the warm place at the base of the mane. He took 1 long breath there. Ada stood 2 steps away and watched his chest rise and fall. She counted to 4 with him and did not say it. Zeke looked up the wall they had come and then down the slope ahead. He put his palm to the rope still tied at Ada's belt and felt the small pulls of the children like birds on a wire. He squared his shoulders. Boone shifted the sled rope from one shoulder to the other and rolled his neck. Hatcher wiped ice from his lashes with 2 fingers and blinked hard until the world had edges again. There was no comfort where they stood. There was only the absence of the worst of it and a line that pointed down. Cole set his hat back on his head and found the next place to put his boot. He moved. The rope hummed in the cold. The cut steps behind them held. The white ahead waited without malice. They leaned into the slope and gave themselves to the work of going down. Dark pines stepped out of the white like a row of ribs. A roofline showed as a smear, then a shack stood clear, with a stovepipe black against the sky. The door was drifted to the latch. Zeke put a shoulder to it, and the wood complained, then gave. Warmth did not come out, only still air dry and old with mouse and dust. They piled inside. Breath made a fog that hung and moved as one thing. A pot-bellied stove sat squat in the corner, with a split elbow on its pipe. 2 bunks. A crate under one. A table on 3 legs that had made its peace with the 4th being gone. The wind laid a hand on the stovepipe and made a soft ring that sounded like a bell rung in a pocket. Cole crossed the threshold last. His knees went loose. Ada and Zeke caught him and steered him to the lower bunk. He sat and swayed and found the wall with his shoulder. His bandage had gone dark and stiff. Blood had frozen along the outside and cracked when he bent. Hatcher had the sense to look for tinder. He found a slat-shaved curls open the stove's mouth and coaxed a flame from a match with careful hands. Smoke climbed into the pipe. Heat came slow and honest. It licked at knuckles and made eyes smart. The room exhaled. Boone dragged the crate out with a grunt. The lid had mouse holes in it. Inside sat a tin of coffee with rust on its seam, a half bag of beans, a tight skin of jerky hard as oak. He laughed once with relief that hurt. Zeke took the finds to the table where Ada was already setting a pot with snow on the stove. Ada cut twine on the jerky and smelled old smoke and animal. She broke pieces with a hammering motion against the table and dropped a fraction into the water to soften. Beans rattled into the pot. The coffee went on the back with a little scoop, a promise more than a drink. She put her palm to each child's cheek and gave them their order with a glance. Children first. No words needed. Cole sat with his back to the wall and watched the stove pull. He breathed the heat like medicine. Ada went to him with a basin of hot water, the color of bark. She set it on the bunk frame and lifted his hand. The bandage stuck. She soaked it where it would not come loose and unwound the rest. The cut had opened where the stitches had stretched on the wall. The edges were angry, but not the color that means the body is quitting. She washed with water hot enough to bite. He watched her face, not his hand. "Hold," she said. He held. She tore a strip from the lining of her coat where it would cost less. She folded it clean side in and made a pad, then bound the hand again with a strip from Jonah's spare shirt. Jonah tore without being asked. His eyes were on nothing. Ada tied a square knot and checked the pulse in each finger. Blood moved where it must. She let out a breath she had been saving. Zeke brought her the first thin cup from the bean pot. She gave each child 3 beans and a spoon of broth. She put a sliver of softened jerky in each small hand and had them suck it, not chew. Color crept back to lips. Eyes remembered they had light in them. Thomas said thank you without being told. The smallest girl leaned her head to Ada's coat and stayed there 2 heartbeats, then went back to her place without fuss. Hatcher poured coffee into a tin lid and held it near the stove so the smell would show up before the drink did. He set the lid near Cole. It was almost nothing, and it helped. Boone wiped his face with both hands and looked smaller and better for it. Riley Voss lay on the lower sled for a while, then crawled to the table and sat with his back to it. He watched the pot. He watched the crate with its corners open to air. His bad arm had gone purple and wrong under the sleeve. He held it like a thing he had stolen and could not return. His eyes never left the food. Night came up to the windows and the panes went black. Snow tapped, then slid. The stovepipe clicked. The shack settled around them with small noises like a ship in harbor. The first round of broth went to the children and the mothers, and then to Hatcher and Zeke and Boone. Ada brought the last swallow to Cole. He drank. He closed his eyes and let heat run down his throat like a little river. He opened them and found her looking at him from a place that knew the tally and did not flinch. They slept in piles around the stove. The heat was thin and real. The room smelled of beans and wet wool and iron. Ada sat with her back to the bunk, knees up, the Colt she had found in Cole's saddlebag across her lap. She had opened the bag to look for salve and met the pistol's oiled weight in the dark. The leather smelled of animal and smoke and blacking. There had been a small black book, too, scuffed at the corners. She had put that back without opening it. She had checked the Colt, felt the heavy cylinder move, felt the click. then set it where her hands remembered it without looking. The fire settled to coals, the stove ticked, the pipe sang another soft circle of sound when the wind found it. In that half-quiet, something scuffed near the crate. Ada's eyes were open before the sound finished. Voss crouched with his good hand on the jerky. Hatcher stood by the door with the beans not moving, as if not moving would keep the choice from seeing him. "We cannot," Hatcher whispered, his voice scraped thin. "They are children. We can," Voss said. "We walk. We make a day of it. The rest will die here, and we will not." Ada did not lift the Colt high. She lifted it enough that the shape took the room. The click when she pulled the hammer back made the air hold still. "Put it down," she said. Voss turned his head like a fox caught looking at a wire. He grinned, then lost the grin. He moved the jerky 2 inches. Ada put the front sight on his chest, the way a teacher puts a pointer to a word. Hatcher stared at the pistol like a congregation stares at a storm. "Mr. Hatcher," Ada said, "put the beans back." He did. His hands shook. He set the bag on the table and stepped away from it, as if it were hot. He raised both palms. He could not look at her. Voss lifted his chin a fraction. "You will not shoot me, teacher." "My hands stitched a man together," she said. "Today. I put a needle in his skin and sewed him shut while he bled on the floor." She did not raise her voice. "I will keep these children alive. Put it back." He weighed her in the room and the fact of the gun. He saw the line she would not cross had been crossed already. He put the jerky in the crate. He took a step back. He tried to make his face say he had chosen to do so. It said something else. "Sit against the wall," Ada said. "Where I can see you." Voss sat. Hatcher slid down by the door and wrapped his arms around his knees. Ada settled the Colt across her lap again and waited for the fire to lower one more shade before she fed it. Her face was set. Her eyes did not blink often. The pistol looked too big for her hands and fit anyway. Just before dawn, the wind weakened. The stove's ring went soft. The cold came back in sharper when it did not have to fight noise. Ada stood slow and set the Colt under her coat at her belt. She moved to Cole. He was awake, eyes clear and sunk deep. His face had lost some of the fever red and kept the pallor. "You have to send for help," he said. His voice was a rasp pulled thin. She watched his mouth to catch the words. "Zeke and I," she said. Her jaw set on the words without ceremony. He nodded once. He lifted his left hand and touched her sleeve. "Keep the pistol," he said. She looked over her shoulder at Hatcher, at Voss, at the children, who were a row of small shapes along the stove face. "I was going to leave it with Zeke," she said. "Keep it," Cole said. His mouth made it a small smile that had no strength and all the weight it needed. Hatcher pushed himself up. "What do I do?" he asked. The words came careful and plain. "Keep the fire. Keep them awake," Cole said. "Make them drink. Names. Say their names to them." Hatcher nodded like a man taking down a list he would not forget. He went to the stove and fed it. He lifted children to sitting and rubbed their backs until sounds came out of them again. He looked older and cleaner in the face. Zeke had the horse saddled with the cinch set careful. He had a coil of rope at his hip and the empty sled roped behind for the downhill. He had taken one strip of jerky and put it in his pocket. He did not touch it. Ada tied her scarf. She set her mitten on Thomas's hair and smoothed it as if the motion might hold him in the room. She touched the smallest girl's cheek and made sure the pink was back near the nails. She tucked Eliza's sleeve and pressed Jonah's wrist. She stepped to Cole and leaned close enough that her breath touched his face. "I will bring them," she said. No promise beyond that, no nod. He closed his eyes for a breath and opened them. He looked at her, like a man marks a landmark he will see again if he lives right. Zeke opened the door. The white stood there, less wild in the trees and bright as a lamp turned up. Ada lifted the Colt under her coat so the weight settled honest against her. She stepped into the cold. Zeke followed and pulled the door to. The latch fell. The shack held the others. The wind found the pipe and set it singing a small, steady ring. Inside, Cole shifted and set his back more firmly. Hatcher fed the fire. The children breathed and rubbed their hands. The room kept them. The day waited with its face unreadable. Time pressed thin. The stove ticked between breaths. Hatcher fed it with a care that made his hands useful again. He moved from child to child and said names as if names were a thread that could keep small bodies tied to the world. Thomas, Eliza, Sarah. He touched a shoulder. He rubbed a back. He lifted a tin lid of hot water to lips and watched swallowing happen. Cole listened for the wind and for the silence under it. Pain in his hand had a steady beat now. He set his back harder to the bunk and let his body be a thing that took weight. He spoke when a voice kept someone from drifting. "Tell me a line," he said to Thomas. "Any line Miss Whitfield put in your head." Thomas frowned, then found it. "Once upon a midnight dreary." He faltered on dreary and smiled because the word felt big in his mouth. Another child picked up the next words like a toy passed hand to hand, while I pondered weak and weary. The rhyme sat in the room and made a little order. They took turns wrong words and right ones, the sound of them a rope. Hatcher closed his eyes and said a bit of a river song he had known as a boy. Zeke would have known all of it, and for a moment Hatcher felt the missing as if it had weight. He pushed more wood into the stove and made the flame climb. Boone sat near the door with his hat off. He stared at the latch as if watching might keep it closed against what he could not name. His shoulders had settled. He did what was asked. He kept his mouth when anger wanted a thing to bite. He looked smaller and better for it. Riley Voss watched the crate. He watched Ada's empty place with the pistol gone. He made plans that slid off one another because hunger had chewed the hard edge off his mind. His arm lay crooked and dark under his sleeve. He held it without looking at it, as if looking would make it worse. When the smell of coffee lifted from the back of the stove, he closed his eyes and let that be a kind of mercy. Night and day did not separate themselves cleanly. The shack learned the rhythm of tending and resting and being called back. The wind leaned and eased in its own time. Cole slept in bits. When he woke, he asked another child for a song and let the room fill with a thin music. He told Hatcher to stack the wood so it would throw a shadow like a wall and keep the draft moving up the pipe. Hatcher nodded and did it, and the stove pulled better. On the second morning, the light came in blue and hard. The small stores had grown smaller. Hatcher shaved beans on the knife's back so more mouths could be touched by their taste. Cole watched the children's mouths to see if corners had lost their red. He watched the smallest girl's fingers to see if the nail beds stayed pink. He talked to Jonah and Eliza Ward in the quiet under the stove noise. He said their names and asked for a sip and handed the cup back and sat with them for a marked minute. He did not mention the bundle folded under the top blanket. He let his body say what could be said. Voss woke from a short, mean sleep and lifted himself on his good elbow. He opened his mouth to speak and closed it again. The room did not belong to him, and he knew it. He leaned back and stared at the ceiling jaw, tight breath loud in his sinuses. He watched a spider dead in a web and tried to make the web into a map that pointed it anywhere else. The third dawn crawled slow and clear. The pipe made a small circle of sound. Hatcher stood up stiff and opened the door a crack to let steam out. Light hit the room and turned the children's hair to pale gold. Outside, the white lay smooth pines cut from it like ink strokes. The air bit the inside of the nose and made the eyes water. Cole lifted on his elbow. He thought he had heard a footstep through the snow's crust. He held still until breath quieted in the shack, and then he heard it again. Not a foot. Hoof on hard pack, the small, solid crunch of a shod horse. Another. He put his palm to the bunk rail and felt the faintest tremor travel the old wood. Hatcher turned his head as if a hand had touched his shoulder. He pushed the door wider. Cole jumped in and hit the stove and turned to a cloud. In that cloud stood riders' figures, black against snow and sky. 4. 5. The one in front sat a bay with a big head and a steady look. The rider had a man's coat over a smaller body and a scarf pulled up. Leather creaked. Breath steamed. The sound of bit and chain sang a tiny bell. Ada swung down before the horse stopped. She staggered once and caught herself on the jam. Her face was cracked with cold and light. Her eyes went over the room in one sweep and took them all in. The children rose and made sounds that were not quite words. Hatcher laughed without making any noise, and then made noise without air in it. Behind Ada came men from Coldwater Bend. Owen Maddox with a coil of rope across his chest. Luther Rourke with a sack that clinked. 2 ranch hands from Silver Butte with blankets rolled behind their saddles. Their mules wore panniers that steamed in the cold. "We found them," someone said from behind the steam. "Bless me, we found them." Ada crossed to Cole where he sat on the bunk. She dropped to her knees and put her hand to his face. He brought his left hand up and touched her wrist as if he were confirming that bone and blood were as he remembered. She leaned her forehead to his for a count that was theirs alone. He closed his eyes and let his breath move through that place, and felt the tension in his face change. Rourke opened the sack, and heat came out of it as a smell. Stew, coffee, bread wrapped in towels. He ladled a thick, dark soup into a tin and set it into Ada's hands. She gave the first spoon to the smallest girl and watched her swallow. The girl cried once the way a body cries when it hurts to come back to itself. Ada held the back of her head and said her name, then the next name and the next, until spoons and mouths matched. Owen Maddox set to work on Voss's arm. He moved the sleeve and frowned at the shape under it. He looked at Cole and met his eyes, and Cole gave a small nod. Maddox fixed a splint rough but true and bound it with strips cut from a shirt. Voss bit a piece of leather and kept his eyes on a knot in the wall. He did not speak. Boone stood and did not know what to do with his hat. Maddox pressed a cup of coffee into his hands. Boone stared down as if the cup held fire in a shape he did not trust. He drank and coughed and drank again. The day soaked in and softened him. Ada fed Cole last. She lifted the spoon and watched it for a second before she moved it to his mouth. He took the stew in and held it and looked at her above the spoon and swallowed. He did not say anything because the truth of the food had a right to sit unchallenged for a breath. They wrapped children in blankets that had been warmed over saddle flaps. They eased them into the arms of men who had come with room in them for carrying. Jonah helped Eliza into a coat with a new button sewn on one side and none on the other. He held her elbow like a man holds a thing that will break if you watch it break. Ada checked each child, pressed each cheek with mittened fingers, and felt the heat come back under the skin. She took the colt from under her coat and put it in Cole's bag where it belonged. Outside, the sky had the color of pewter, and the cold made every sound more itself. The line of horses turned and stood. The bay Ada had ridden flicked an ear and breathed steam like a train. The bell in town would be too far to hear from here, but Ada felt the pull on a rope in her ribs. She put Thomas onto a mule and tied him steady with a loop through his belt. She swung back onto the bay with help from Maddox's knee and settled her weight. Cole stood with Zeke and the ranch hands holding him by the elbows until his legs answered true. He put his left hand to Jack Straw's neck and then to the saddle. He did not try to throw a leg. He let the men lift, and he did the work of becoming a rider again from the waist up. Pain flared hard and then settled into its usual box. He nodded once to himself and held steady. They set out. Snow whispered under hooves. Leather creaked. The stew smell thinned and left behind the bitter rightness of coffee on breath. The pines fell away and the white opened. The gorge lost its grip. The world made room. When Coldwater Bend came up out of the day, the telegraph wire sang like the sound in Cole's head in clean metal. The church bell rang once and then again. Not a call, just an answer. People came out with hands over mouths and coats swung on with one arm. The street made space for the riders. Mrs. Rourke lifted her apron to her face and cried into it and did not care who saw. The children slid down into other arms. Names flew low and true. Thomas found the ground and stood right there with his feet planted and grinned with a crust of stew on his lip. Ada swung down and almost fell. Owen caught her elbow and steadied her, and then stood back with a look that said more than his mouth would manage. She thanked him with her eyes and moved toward Cole. The doctor met them at the livery because the men who had ridden in had sent a boy ahead. He took Cole's hand in both his own and frowned at the soaked bandage. He led him toward a room above the office where there was a bed that had not seen a body lately and a window that looked north. Ada followed with the bag. The room smelled of alcohol and linen and soap ground into a floorboard. The doctor wanted the hand. He wanted to cut. Ada stood where he could see her and said no with no rise in her voice. She showed him clean edges and good blood in the way fingers still pinked at the tips. She showed him a square knot she had tied with her own hands. He grunted and saw he would be watched with a kind of attention that did not accuse but did not move. Cole lay back and let the room roll. He watched Ada set the bag on the chair and open the top. He watched her pull the salve and the needle and the clean cloth. He watched her look at him with a calm that let him drift towards sleep, without the sudden jerk back that comes when a man thinks he is being left. He closed his eyes and felt the bed's clean sag and the shape of a pillow under his skull and knew where he was. Outside, the bell rang again. Not loud. Enough. The telegraph wire sang its high note. The street boiled for a time and then settled, as if a tide had come in and found its level. In the evening, Hatcher sat on the livery steps and watched the last glow slip from the rims. He kept the names in his mouth like a string of beads. He rubbed a hand over his face and looked better. Boone walked past him and did not look away. Voss lay in the doctor's side room, with his arm bound hard. He stared at the ceiling and tried to hate through a fog. It was a dull job. He let his eyes close. He had nowhere to go. The law would find him where he lay. In the small room above the office, Ada set a chair and fell asleep in it, with her hands slack and her face softer than Cole had seen it. The Colt lay in the bag again, heavy and quiet. Cole opened his eyes once in the night and looked at her. He saw the line of her jaw, and the tired bravado drained away. He felt the wire in his head go quiet for the first time since the storm woke. He closed his eyes and let sleep come, the way a man lets a horse take the weight when the ground starts to tilt. He did not dream. He rested. Snow retreated by inches. Gutters dripped. The alleys turned to brown glass where mud held a skin of ice that cracked under a heel. On the ridge, the last cornices broke off at noon and fell like folded linens off a line. The telegraph wire sang a cleaner note in the warmer air. Cole Mercer learned his hand again. He sat by the upstairs window over the livery and opened and closed the fingers until the stitch line pulled without tearing. The palm was stiff and ugly and very much alive. Below, harness clinked, and men talked about calves and wages in voices that carried a new shape when they said his name. He kept the window cracked for the smell of wet dust and hot iron from Owen Maddox's shop. Mrs. Rourke climbed the outside stair and set a small loaf on the sill without stepping into the room. "For your strength," she said. She glanced at his bandage and then away, like looking too long might make it worse. He nodded and broke the bread with his left hand and the weak one together. He chewed slow and tasted yeast and a ghost of fennel and the clean salt of kindness. Foreman Rudd from the Silver Butte outfit came by one afternoon with a hat in his hands. He stood 2 steps down from the door and did not ask to be invited in. "I did not see," he said. It was not apology or boast. It was a weight set down between them. He held out his hand. Cole took it and felt rope scars against rope scars. They shook. Rudd cleared his throat and went back down. Ada Whitfield came at the blue edge of a day when the rims were still white and the streets had turned to soup. She wore a dress the color of evening and a coat with new patches. Her wrist was bare where a watch chain might have been. She carried a parcel tied with twine. She did not sit until he told her to. He slid the string free. Leather showed oiled and deep brown. Boots, good ones, stitched along the seams with an even hand. The tops bent soft when he pressed them. Near the ankle, a set of letters had been worked in waxed thread. C and M, a little crooked on the C where the needle had met a tough patch in one. Ada watched him touch the letters with the pad of his thumb. She did not explain the missing watch. She set her hands on her knees like a student waiting for the bell. He looked up, and the air in the small room shifted. He set the boots aside and put his left hand over his right wrist. "My mother was Ute," he said. "My father was not." The words sat steady on the floorboards. He looked at the scar on his neck without touching it. "I rode for a captain who pointed into a cut and called it duty. I said no. He fired. I left. I have been leaving since." Ada did not rush her breath. The room heard the knock of a wagon wheel in the street below and the ping of the stove in the office, and then those sounds faded. She turned her head to the window. Out there on the street, children ran on boards laid over the mud. They chased a tin hoop. They shouted names that bounced off walls and came back grinning. She let that live in the room a moment. "You are here," she said. "Das Sunday said." He made a sound in his throat that could have been a laugh, with its show-off scraped off. He tried to keep his face turned away and failed. Ada reached across and set her fingers lightly at his jaw. Not a demand. A presence. He let her turn his face back to hers. "I ran," he said. "You lived," she said. She lifted his bandaged hand between both of hers. She traced the line where her stitches had sat, now healed under clean cloth. She did not say more. The hall clock downstairs ticked. The telegraph wire sang one hard syllable out over the flats and was quiet again. He drew a breath that went all the way down for the first time that day. He set his forehead to hers and counted to 4. When he leaned back, he looked at the boots like a man looks at a thing he will wear until it dies. "You did this," he said. She nodded. He did not ask with what money. She did not tell him about a thin chain handed across a counter. It lived between them without words. Work picked up at the edge of town where the ground sloped south and took sun early. Hammers popped like far shots. Men lifted lengths of new pine that glittered sap. Women brought water in buckets that steamed in the cool. Children carried nails in aprons and called it pay. The frame of a long, single-room building grew rib by rib. Windows looked south, so light would land on slates and stay there. Ada stood on the new step with a chalk stub and drew a bell in the air where the real one would hang. Thomas watched her hand and made the shape in the dust with his boot. Eliza Ward sat on the step with Sarah Ward's old shawl around her shoulders and let her face feel sun. Jonah drove pegs for Owen and did not hit his thumb. Cole walked up with a slow, deliberate gait, new boots dark with wet. He flexed his bad hand around a square of sandpaper and smoothed the sill until the grain quit arguing. He worked without hurry. When the ache rose, he set the board down and pressed his palm to the smooth wood and took its cool into him. He did not look toward the horizon where the road left town. He kept his eyes on the cut ends, the fresh pale of them, the way sap showed like tears, and then stopped. Owen Maddox came up the slope with a long painted board on his shoulder. He set it down careful and pulled the burlap. Letters clean and black rode the white. Mercer Shelter Schoolhouse. The paint shone wet still. Ada's mouth opened and shut, and then opened again. She touched the M and came away with a fleck of black on her fingertip. She smiled at the smear and did not wipe it off. Owen tipped his cap to her and to Cole both. "You tell me where to set it," he said. His voice carried pride and the comfortable rasp of a man who had brought a thing to its proper place. Ada pointed to the lintel. Owen nodded and got his tools. Cole took one end while Owen took the other. They lifted together, found center with 2 small moves, and set it square. The screws bit with a tight little squeal that satisfied something low in the chest. Foreman Rudd stood nearby with 2 of his hands. He said nothing. He looked at the letters and then at Cole. He gave a short nod. One of the men spat aside and hit his own boot and did not notice. The other shaded his eyes and squinted at how straight the sign sat and said, "Good." The children found the old rope in a corner of the yard, where someone had thrown it after unloading. It was the loop line, stiff with old cold and then made soft by handling. Thomas shook it out, and it swung with a memory of hands. 2 of the older girls took the ends and turned. The small ones jumped in one by one, coats flipping, hats sliding back, breath going in little gasps that sounded like laughter and exhaustion mixed. Ada watched and heard the whisper of the rope on dirt, and the small scuff of boots, and the counting that missed, and started over and did not mind. A bell came up from town in Mrs. Rourke's arms, a brass cup with a bite out of the rim from some forgotten accident. Owen hung it over the door on a hook he had set the day before. Ada pulled the rope and the bell answered, not loud, clear. The note lay gently over the yard and down the slope into Coldwater Bend. Heads turned in the street. The telegraph wire took no notice. It had its own song. Riley Voss, arm-bound and eyes careful, went past in a wagon on his way to the small courtroom that had been a feed store once. He looked up at the sign and then away quick. No one called to him. That silence had edge and mercy both. Boone Kearney stood under a cottonwood and watched the children with a face that was still and a hat held by the brim. He did not step forward. He did not step back. Hatcher walked by with a length of trim on his shoulder and set it down where Ada pointed, then went to fetch another. Ada stood close to Cole at the step and wiped the paint smudge from her finger onto her skirt where no one would care. She rested her hand over his on the fresh pine. His palm was rough and warm, and the scar under the skin tugged less. She looked at his profile and the set of his mouth, and at the line cut by years of wind and sun, and a winter that had taken from him and then given back. He turned his hand and laced their fingers. No talk. The bell shook once in a stray breeze and made a small sound to mark the moment without calling attention to it. The smell of sawdust and hot iron and green sap hung together in the mild air. A wagon rattled past with a bale of hay roped tight. The knots looked good. Ada's breath slowed and matched his. Thomas missed a count in the jump rope and laughed when he tripped and rolled and came up grinning. Eliza tucked hair behind her ear and tilted her face toward the pale sun. Jonah leaned his shoulder into a post and let the weight run down into the dirt. Cole lifted his eyes to the letters once more and then to the far line of the hills. They were blue at the edges, soft, not a call. He looked back at the door, at the bell, at the rope turned to play, at the children whose names he knew. He put his hand flat to the lintel below the sign and felt the grain. Ada's hand covered his. The wire on the street sang itself thin and quiet. The bell answered with 3 clear notes, and the sound settled into the day like it belonged there. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.